And then Tom came back, and they played a festival called Coachella. And even though it didn't sound very good at all, everyone was so happy.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and if you've watched any of my other videos, especially the ones on my second channel, then you probably know that I believe the 2000s is the peak of human civilization. After all, that is the decade that brought us the OC, Whale Tail, Von Dutch hats, and of course, the golden era of pop punk. Bands like Blink-182, Sum 41, and New Found Glory were all over TRL, Green Day dropped American Idiot, Simple Plan were in the Olsen Twins movie, Travis Barker had a reality show.
Meet Travis. He's the ultimate musician. He's a wonderful father.
Did you have good baby dreams, huh?
And a hopeless romantic.
Beautiful.
But those days are long gone, right? Well, maybe not, because if you didn't know better, if you looked around, you might think that you were back in 2003. Blink is back with Tom selling out arenas. When We Were Young is the hottest festival. Elder emos are all over TikTok talking about how much they love pop punk. And a whole new crop of artists like Sueko and Maggie Lindemann are putting out some great music. So what's going on? Why is pop punk having a moment? And is this a sign of something bigger, or is it just a nostalgic cash grab? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. And also, I'm excited to have Tiege Hanley as the sponsor of today's video. They help men start and maintain a skincare routine by simplifying the entire process. Honestly, it's the best skincare system for guys like you and me. I recommend you start with their Level 1 system, which comes with all the basics. A daily face wash to get rid of all the dirt and grime on your skin, a 2 times per week exfoliating scrub to get rid of all those dead skin cells, an AM moisturizer with SPF 20 because you should always be protecting your skin against the sun, and a PM moisturizer to help your skin stay hydrated and healthy throughout the night. My favorite part about Tiege Hanley is that every box comes with an instruction card, just like this one, that tells you when to use each product, how much to use, and in what order. Their products have made my skin look and feel better than ever, but you don't have to just take my word for it. They have over 7,000 5-star reviews on their website from satisfied customers all over the world. And because Tiege Hanley is sponsoring today's video, they are offering my viewers a great deal. Just click the first link in the description of this video, and you'll get 30% off your first box, plus a free gift. So don't miss out on this amazing deal. Click that link and get started today. I made a couple videos earlier this year about the resurgence of emo and nu metal, and the basic point of those videos is about how we've seen this whole new wave of young people getting into bands like Pierce the Veil, My Chemical Romance, Deftones, and Korn, as well as the older generation who was into those bands when they came out, having sort of a renewed interest. Essentially, it's two generations who are all sort of into the same older bands, which leads to this, like, honestly kind of wholesome phenomenon of parents and kids bonding over their love of emo and nu metal. But the pop punk revival is a bit different. It's almost like two separate revivals happening at once. One for the kids and one for the old people like me. And to be clear, the pop punk revival has actually been happening for a while. I think it started back in 2020, with maybe the first big sign that was happening was all the TikToks with Dear Maria by All Time Low, where 32-year-olds assured you that no, it was definitely not a phase.
Mom, it was never a phase, it's a lifestyle. Cause I got your picture, I'm coming with you, dear Maria, tell me it.
And unlike the recent Deftones revival, this was not a whole new generation of teenagers discovering the old bands. These were grown adults with the toddlers to prove it.
Hammy.
What?
I got
picture and come with you. There will come a
The same year, Simple Plan was also trending on TikTok with the I'm Just a Kid challenge, where people would look back at themselves as kids compared to now. Again, sort of getting at this theme of like, man, we are old now, what happened? And eventually even getting huge stars like Will Smith on board with the challenge.
When you're spending every day on your own, and here it goes, I'm just a kid.
And on the back of all that TikTok interest, All Time Low had the biggest song of their career with Monsters, which hit #1 on the alternative charts for the first time in their career. And it was clear that the genre was getting more interest than it had in a while. And by the way, 50% of you guys are not subscribed, so if you like my videos, please hit that subscribe button. It does help my channel. But in my opinion, the real turning point that kicked off the revival was MGK's album Tickets to My Downfall from later that year. And he had dabbled in rock before, like he played Warped Tour back in 2012, he did a song with Sleeping with Sirens in 2013. He had covered Operation Ivy live for years, but he was primarily known as a rapper. And so it kind of came out of the blue for him to drop an entire album of pop punk that sounded pretty much like an unreleased Blink album from 2002, even including Travis Barker on drums and In My Yed in the lyrics. And regardless of whether you like it or not, or whether you think Eminem made him switch genres or any of that, the fact of the matter is that it was a huge album. It went to #1 on Billboard, which was the first pop punk album to do that since Blink hit #1 with California, which was itself the first pop punk album to do that in a very, very long time. He was in all kinds of TMZ headlines, and I think generally showed the industry that pop punk was hot again. And here is where I think it gets interesting, because MGK's success really kind of divided the scene in half. On the one hand, there were the elder emos who were making TikToks about Simple Plan and All Time Low and singing along to pop punk classics with their toddlers. And to put it simply, they hated anything and everything to do with MGK. But on the other hand, for the newer generation, his style of, I guess you could say, like rap-infused pop punk became the template for an entire wave of similar stuff. Basically, all the artists you've seen in the last few years with the Travis Barker feature. My personal favorite of that wave is Sueko, who I think is super talented with some of the best songwriting I've heard in the genre in a really long time. There was also this wave of people who were primarily known as TikTokers and influencers, turning into pop punk artists, for example, Lil Huddy and Jaden. And in the case of Jaden, he also collabed with Travis Barker and MGK just to sort of tie it all back. And there were some more established artists who also kind of caught that wave and went back to their roots. For example, Avril Lavigne came back with the most pop punk album of her career. There's also Mod Sun, who had actually been around for quite a while. He played in bands like Scary Kids, Scaring Kids, like a decade ago. But he really sort of rose to prominence with his pop punk album, and after collaborating with, you guessed it, Travis Barker and MGK. But maybe the most interesting example of one of those established artists coming back to pop punk is Demi Lovato. You may know Demi from being on Barney and Disney shows when she was a kid, and later becoming one of the bigger pop artists of the 2010s with songs like Sorry, but she's recently gone back to her roots as a 2000 scene kid with her album Holy Fuck. Which in my eyes is a pretty big deal because Demi Lovato is, to put it simply, really fucking famous. Just to put it in perspective, at the time that I'm recording this, she has 27 million Spotify listeners, and for comparison, Metallica has 24 million. Another big difference between the revival and the first wave of artists in the 2000s is that now there are way more female artists. I honestly can't even think of a single 2000s pop punk band with even one female member. I'm sure there is one, but I can't think of it. But when you look at the revival, there are tons of really prominent female artists. For example, Lolo, Maggie Lindemann, and my personal favorite, Charlotte Sands.
I had a no good, really bad, messed up day, and I'm stressed out.
And again, I think this really matters. I'm not big into identity politics or any of that kind of thing, and I don't think that the 2000s bands were misogynist or anything like you may hear other people say. And a lot of girls obviously loved the music, but I do think it's fair to say when it came to the bands themselves, it was kind of a boys' club. And the most recent development, which I find pretty interesting, is this entire wave of former emo rappers turned pop punk artists. Like, it feels like within the past 3 years, everybody stopped doing emo rap and turned into a pop punker. And there's tons of examples of this, but maybe two of the best would be Smart Death and Lil Lotus, both of which are on Epitaph now.
Fell in love with the girl next door. Fell so hard I almost went through the floor.
Even Fat Nick has a pop punk album, which honestly, I never expected that to happen. And I know that all these guys will hate me for saying this, but to me, it's kind of like the underground version of MGK's pivot in that none of them were really like rappers to begin with. These were all emo and pop punk kids who rapped, but they didn't really have anything to do with hip hop culture. And oftentimes they would sample bands like Census Fail and stuff. And so it really makes sense that they would go back to their roots and just play pop punk. And speaking of that, another big difference is that the current wave of pop punk is really dominated by solo artists as opposed to bands, which I find pretty interesting. Like, the idea of a pop punk solo artist would have been pretty weird 20 years ago, where it was all about bands. But now being a solo artist in the genre is kind of the default. And I think that's for a few reasons. For one, it's a lot cheaper and easier to be a solo artist and either record everything yourself if you can play all the instruments, which a lot of these people can, or if you can't, just have a producer make the tracks for you. Like, why put up with that annoying bassist in your band if you don't have to? But more than that, I think it just really makes more sense from a marketing perspective. Because really, it's always been easier to promote solo artists over bands. I mean, if you think about it, how many groups are there in pop or hip hop, for example, as opposed to solo artists? There's obvious exceptions like BTS or the Migos or whatever, but they are just that. Those are the exceptions that prove the rule. And this is especially true now in the TikTok era, because sort of the default pattern of human behavior is that we connect with other individuals over groups. This is the reason why people think of Jeff Bezos as the face of Amazon, right? And this shift towards solo artists makes even more sense considering that a lot of these people are really influencers first and musicians second. For example, Jaden, who was a popular TikToker before he started making music and signing to Travis Barker's label, or Sueko. I'm not sure if his music or his TikToks came first, but either way, he is pretty great at TikTok.
You're a piece of shit. No one cares if you go missing. You could jump right off a bridge.
And that matters because, as we all know, the entire music industry is basically driven by TikTok. So if what you're doing isn't marketable on that app, that's a problem. But maybe the biggest difference is that basically none of this new generation of pop punk artists has any connection to, for lack of a better word, real punk. And just to be clear, I'm not the type of person to tell people that their music isn't valid because it's not quote unquote real punk. Like, I don't care about that stuff, but it is a real difference. And what I mean by that is if you look at 90s bands like, say, Green Day or The Offspring, who eventually ended up on major labels and MTV and all that, they came up playing very legit DIY venues with bands like Neurosis and Capitalist Casualties. And even Blink, who I would say are substantially less punk than that, even they played with bands like Guttermouth and the Vandals. And when it comes to the 2000s bands, a surprising amount of them, for example, like Newfound Glory, AFI, and Fall Out Boy, all come from the hardcore scene. For example, I remember seeing Andy from Fall Out Boy's old band Race Trader play on the floor with Hatebreed in 1998. But with this new wave of artists, their influences are mostly the 2000s bands that they grew up seeing on TRL. And to me, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but I do think it makes their music feel a little bit too slick for some people. Maybe it feels like a copy of a copy to them. But with that being said, I really don't think it's fair to say that it's somehow shallow or Disney-fied compared to older pop punk. For one, let me remind you that this is a song by the greatest 2000s pop punk band. This was not exactly intellectual stuff.
Tried to fuck your dad in the ass. Could only find the dog and his ass.
And I think lyrically, a lot of this new stuff actually is pretty great. For example, Demi Lovato's album, which talks very openly about her struggle with addiction and mental health. For those who don't know, she's been through a lot. She had an overdose where she had a stroke and almost died. And she just kind of lays it all out there on this album.
God damn it, I just wanna be free, but I can't 'cause it's a fucking disease.
And if you're unfamiliar with a lot of the artists that I just mentioned, let me be clear, these are not small artists. They are putting up very respectable numbers. For example, Sueko currently has 3.6 million listeners on Spotify. Maggie Lindemann has 4.2 million, which really isn't too far off from some of the biggest names of the 2000s like Good Charlotte, who are coming in at 5.7 million. And so what's really interesting to me is how little attention any of this is getting from the music media. Like, when was the last time you heard anybody talk about half the artists that I mentioned? I would guess that for a lot of people watching this video is the first time you've heard of a lot of these people. And part of that, I think, is just the usual dynamic where the new generation of artists is ignored or rejected by the older generation, and they don't really get the recognition they deserve until their fans get to be old enough to be where they're the ones writing the narratives, which was actually the case for 2000s pop punk to a certain extent, in that even bands like Sum 41 and Blink-182 didn't really get that much respect back in the day. For example, here's what Entertainment Weekly said about Sum 41's All Killer No Filler before giving it a C+. These four Canadians mostly stick to the sort of annoyingly generic grade school punk that Green Day outgrew several albums ago. Getting over more on speed and spirit than hooks and substance, Sum 41 ultimately don't add up to much. And so maybe it will just take another 10 or 15 years for people to put Sueko, Lil Lotus, Jaden, and Maggie Lindemann up there with Blink and Sum 41, but I don't think so. Because to put it simply, it's a different world now. Unlike back in the day where people like very much rejected Sum 41 and Good Charlotte and all that, I don't think that anybody is rejecting this new wave of artists. I think they literally don't even know that they exist. I talked about this in my video about the emo revival, but there's a concept called the monoculture, which essentially refers to the time where we pretty much all followed the same things in pop culture. Like Friends, Seinfeld, Super Mario Brothers, Pokemon, SpongeBob. Even if you didn't like or care about any of those things, you at least knew about them. Like everybody knows the Seinfeld bass line even if you've never watched the show. And classic 2000s pop punk was very much a product of that era. Remember, almost all these bands were on major labels. They were on the cover of huge mainstream magazines like Rolling Stone. They were all over MTV. Just to give you an idea of exactly how mainstream this stuff was, like Blink-182 hosted MTV's Spring Break special. This was not underground stuff.
Hello there, welcome to MTV's favorite spring break performances. We're surrounded by boobies and in sunny San Diego, California.
And so I think a big part of why this new generation of pop punk artists isn't really getting a lot of recognition, and maybe in a way feels like it's not important, even though they're getting millions and millions of streams on TikTok and Spotify, and like clearly people are into this stuff, is because of the death of the monoculture. Because there's an almost infinite amount of content and influencers, and a new thing trending every day on every platform, nothing really feels important anymore, right? But you compare that to 15 or 20 years ago, when there were far fewer opportunities for anybody to be in the spotlight, and everything felt more special. Like back then, it was a huge deal if a band got the chance to play on one of the late night shows. I remember being so excited when Quicksand played on the Jon Stewart Show back in the day.
A tremendous band performing Thorn in My Side from the album Manic Compression. Please welcome Quicksand.
And that didn't make Quicksand into superstars or anything like that, so maybe it wasn't as big of a deal as it felt like to me, but at the same time, objectively speaking, it was a big deal. Because back then, this was before the internet was what it is today, and there were maybe only 5 or 6 TV channels with anything worth watching at 11 p.m. on a weeknight, and so just because there were so few options, they were pretty much guaranteed to have at least a few million people see them on that show. And it was the same thing a few years later with Blink doing MTV's Spring Break, or Pierre from Simple Plan's Prank Show. Those things really were a big deal, and they made those bands feel really special in a way that I just don't think is possible anymore. Because opportunities like that just don't really exist in the TikTok era. Now we have basically an infinite amount of content distributed across an infinite amount of algorithmically generated feeds. Which on the one hand is amazing because it means you get exactly what you want and you don't have to see any of the stuff you don't care about. But on the other hand, like I said, doesn't it kind of make you feel like nothing is special anymore? How often does something come along in pop culture that really feels like an event? There was the Barbenheimer thing a couple weeks ago, but that's really like the first example I can think of in honestly years. And so in the context of music, what you see is that a song could have 500 million plays on Spotify and be trending all over TikTok, but still never make it outside the algorithm bubble. So if you're not in the target audience for that song, you don't even know it exists. And to tie this back to the current wave of pop punk, think about MGK. He's hands down the most well-known artist of this current pop punk revival, and he is a legitimate celebrity that's in the gossip headlines and all that stuff. But even he doesn't feel like he has anywhere near the same level of cultural impact that Blink did in their prime. And so the reason that I think people are going back to the classics like Blink, Sum 41, and New Found Glory is because of that. There isn't a new Blink because there can never be another Blink. The machine that built them simply doesn't exist anymore and probably never will. Alright my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos and podcasts early. I do giveaways. There are members-only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in. There's also a way to have me review your music, so if any of that sounds cool to you, hit the link in the description of this video, and with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.